Jane Morrison's hands trembled as she pushed the mop across the pristine marble floors of St. Catherine's Medical Center. The same floors where Dr. Matthew Chen would walk in exactly 37 minutes, based on the schedule she'd memorized over the past 6 months. But he wouldn't recognize her now. Not in the gray janitor's uniform, not with the exhaustion etched into her 25-year-old face, and certainly not as the girl who'd once promised to wait for him forever. 8 years ago, Jane had been the star student, valedictorian of their high school class, with a full scholarship to pre-med. Matthew had been her everything, brilliant, ambitious, and desperately in love with her. Their last night before he left for medical school, he'd held her hands in his parents' backyard and whispered, "Wait for me, Jane. 4 years of med school, then residency. I know it's asking a lot, but I'll wait," she'd interrupted, her 17-year-old heart so certain of forever. "I'll be right here when you come back, Dr. Chen." Now, as she wrung out the dirty water, Jane wondered what that naive girl would think seeing her now. But she didn't have time for self-pity. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, expensive shoes clicking against marble with the confidence of someone who belonged in this world. "Doctor." Matthew Chen appeared around the corner, and Jane's breath caught in her throat. He looked exactly like the man she'd dreamed he'd become, tall, distinguished in his white coat, with the same dark eyes that had once promised her the world. Those eyes now glanced past her without recognition, focused on the tablet in his hands as he reviewed patient files. "Excuse me," he said politely, stepping around her mop bucket without really seeing her. Jane kept her head down, heart hammering as he passed. "Of course, doctor." He paused for just a moment, something in her voice catching his attention. But then his pager buzzed, and he was gone, hurrying toward the cardiac wing where he was now the youngest department head in the hospital's history. What Matthew didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Jane had kept her promise in the cruelest way possible. The truth was a weight Jane carried every day, heavier than the industrial cleaning supplies she lugged through endless hospital corridors. She had waited for Matthew Chen. She'd waited through her mother's cancer diagnosis 2 years into college, waited through the chemotherapy bills that swallowed her scholarship money, waited through the desperate nights when she'd worked 3 jobs just to keep their tiny apartment while her mother fought for her life. She'd waited right through her mother's funeral 4 years ago, attended alone because Matthew was in his 3rd year of medical school, and she couldn't bring herself to be the needy girlfriend calling with bad news. She'd waited through selling their house to pay medical debts, through moving to a studio apartment in the worst part of town, through taking the first job she could find that offered health insurance, even if it was cleaning the very hospital where her former dreams had been meant to unfold. Jane had waited, all right. She'd waited while her life fell apart, while her college friends moved on to careers and marriages, while Matthew's social media showed him at medical conferences and graduation ceremonies, always with the same beautiful blonde resident who'd started appearing in his photos during his final year, Dr. Sarah Williams. Jane knew her name because she cleaned Sarah's office every Tuesday and Thursday. She knew Sarah's coffee order, oat milk latte, extra shot, her schedule, cardiothoracic surgery just like Matthew, and the engagement ring that had appeared on her finger 6 months ago, right around the time Jane had started working at St. Catherine's. "Jane! You missed a spot near Dr. Williams' desk," called Rita, the head of janitorial services, poking her head into the office. "I'll get it," Jane replied, spraying the expensive mahogany surface where Sarah's nameplate read, "Dr. Sarah Williams, M.D., cardiothoracic surgery." Soon to be Dr. Sarah Chen, no doubt. Rita softened, noticing Jane's expression. At 62, she'd seen enough heartbreak to recognize it. "Honey, you know you're too smart to be pushing a mop around here forever. That college degree of yours doesn't pay my mother's medical bills," Jane finished quietly. She'd dropped out junior year, but Rita didn't need to know that. Some truths were too complicated to explain. But Rita was right about one thing. Jane was different from the other custodial staff. She spoke multiple languages fluently, had an instinctive understanding of medical terminology from her pre-med days, and possessed an uncanny ability to anticipate what the doctors and nurses needed before they asked. More than once, she'd quietly corrected medication labels that had been misfiled, or noticed equipment malfunctions that could have endangered patients. The doctors had started to notice her, in the way you notice reliable furniture. Present, useful, but not worth remembering. All except Matthew, who remained obliviously focused on his rising career and his perfect fiancée. That was about to change. The accident happened on a Tuesday that started like any other. Jane was cleaning the cardiac ICU when she heard the commotion, ambulances screaming into the emergency bay, nurses running, the controlled chaos that meant someone's life hung in the balance. "Multi-car accident on Highway 9, someone shouted. "We've got 3 critical coming in." Jane pressed herself against the wall as gurneys rushed past, but her blood turned to ice when she saw the face of the first patient. Mrs. Chen, Matthew's mother, the woman who had been like a second mother to Jane throughout high school. Blood matted her silver hair, and her breathing was labored, but Jane would recognize those kind eyes anywhere. "Mrs. Chen," Jane whispered, her professional invisibility forgotten as she moved toward the trauma bay. "Ma'am, you need to stay back," a nurse said firmly, blocking her path. But Jane could see Matthew rushing toward the gurney, his face white with terror. Mom, can you hear me?" Mrs. Chen's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy from the head trauma. But as her gaze swept the room, it landed on Jane's face, and something miraculous happened. Recognition sparked in those fading eyes, and her lips moved soundlessly. Jane stepped forward without thinking. "I'm here, Mrs. Chen. I'm here." "Jane?" Mrs. Chen's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried across the trauma bay like thunder. Matthew's head snapped up, following his mother's gaze. For 8 years, Jane had imagined this moment, what it would feel like when he finally saw her again. She'd never imagined it would be like this, with his mother fighting for her life between them. Their eyes met across the chaos of medical equipment and rushing personnel. Time stopped. The boy who had promised to come back for her stared at the woman she'd become. Uniform wrinkled from work, hair pulled back in a practical bun, hands rough from industrial cleaning supplies. This wasn't how their reunion was supposed to happen. "Jane Morrison?" Matthew's voice cracked like he was 17 again. But before she could respond, Mrs. Chen coded. The heart monitor's steady beep became a shrill alarm, and Matthew snapped back into doctor mode, his personal shock buried under years of medical training. "Get me crash cart. Starting compressions." Jane backed away, her heart breaking as she watched Matthew fight to save his mother's life. But Mrs. Chen's eyes found hers one more time, and her lips moved in what Jane knew was a thank you, for keeping the promise, for being there, for waiting, even when he hadn't. 40 minutes later, Mrs. Chen was stable but critical, and Matthew Chen was walking directly toward Jane with an expression she couldn't read. "Jane." Matthew's voice held 8 years of questions, confusion, and something that might have been pain. "What? How are you here? Why are you—" He gestured helplessly at her uniform, unable to finish the question that would sound cruel no matter how he phrased it. "I work here," Jane said simply, her chin lifting with a dignity that made Matthew's chest ache. Even in a janitor's uniform, she carried herself like the queen she'd always been to him. "But your scholarship, pre-med. You were going to Johns Hopkins. Life happened, Matthew." Jane's voice was steady, but he could see the cost of that steadiness in the way she held herself. "How is she?" The subject change was deliberate, and Matthew recognized the Jane he'd once known in that small act of protection, shielding herself from questions that would hurt too much to answer. Stable, critical but stable. She'll want to see you when she wakes up. She said your name." His voice broke slightly. "She said your name before anyone else's." Jane nodded, tears threatening. "She was always kind to me. Jane, I need to know." Matthew started, then stopped as Dr. Sarah Williams appeared at his elbow. Matthew, honey, I heard about your mother. I'm so sorry. Sarah's perfectly manicured hand rested on Matthew's arm with practiced comfort. Is there anything I can do? The diamond on her ring finger caught the fluorescent lights, and Jane saw Matthew's face change as he remembered where he was, who he was now, and who was standing beside him. Sarah, this is... Matthew hesitated, and Jane saw the exact moment he realized how impossible this introduction would be. How do you explain the girl you left behind to the woman you're going to marry? Jane Morrison, Jane supplied smoothly, extending her hand to Sarah. I work in housekeeping. I knew Mrs. Chen when Matthew and I were in high school. Sarah's smile was polite, but dismissive. Oh, how nice. I'm Dr. Williams, Matthew's fiancé. Congratulations, Jane said and meant it. Matthew always deserved someone who could keep up with his ambitions. Something in her tone made Matthew look at her sharply, but Jane was already stepping back. I should get back to work. I'm glad she's going to be okay, Matthew. Jane, wait. But she was already walking away, and Matthew was left standing between his past and his future, understanding for the first time that some choices echo through your entire life. What he didn't know was that Jane's shift didn't end for another 4 hours, and she would spend every one of them in the cardiac ICU waiting room, just in case Mrs. Chen needed her. Some promises, once made, become part of who you are. Mrs. Chen woke up asking for Jane. It was 2 a.m., and Jane had long since finished her official shift, but she'd stayed in the waiting room, dozing in an uncomfortable chair because leaving felt impossible. Matthew had been dividing his time between his mother's bedside and Sarah, who had finally gone home around midnight with promises to return first thing in the morning. She's asking for Jane again, the night nurse told Matthew quietly. She's quite agitated, says she needs to tell Jane something important. Matthew found Jane in the waiting room, still in her uniform, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. She was awake, staring at her hands, and when she looked up at him, he saw the girl he'd fallen in love with at 17, brilliant, caring, and carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She wants to see you, he said softly. Jane nodded and followed him through the ICU doors, past the machines and monitors to where Mrs. Chen lay propped up against white pillows. Even with the oxygen mask and bandages, her eyes were alert and focused on Jane with desperate intensity. Jane, sweetheart. Mrs. Chen's voice was weak but determined. She reached out with a trembling hand, and Jane took it without hesitation. I'm here, Mrs. Chen. You need to rest. No, need to tell you. Need to tell Matthew. Mrs. Chen's grip tightened with surprising strength. The letters. Jane went very still. Mrs. Chen, please. What letters? Matthew asked, looking between them. Mrs. Chen's eyes never left Jane's face. The letters you wrote him. Every month for 3 years. I kept them. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Jane's face went white, and Matthew felt something cold and terrible settle in his stomach. What letters, Mom? Mrs. Chen struggled to sit up higher, her breathing labored but her voice gaining strength. Jane wrote to you, every month. Told you about her mother's cancer, asked for nothing but wanted you to know. I thought it would distract you from school. Matthew's world tilted. You kept Jane's letters. Hidden them, in the cedar chest. Thought I was protecting your future. Tears leaked from Mrs. Chen's eyes. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. Jane was backing toward the door, her face a mask of humiliation. I should go. You need to rest, Mrs. Chen. Jane, wait. Matthew's voice was raw. How many letters? Jane stopped, but didn't turn around. 37. 1 every month from when Mom was diagnosed until... Her voice broke. Until I realized you were never going to write back. The math was simple and devastating. 3 years of letters. 3 years of Jane reaching out while thinking he was ignoring her suffering. 3 years of his mother intercepting every plea for connection, every attempt to maintain the promise they'd made. You wrote to me about your mother's cancer, Matthew's voice was barely a whisper. Finally, Jane turned around, and the pain in her eyes nearly brought him to his knees. I wrote to you about everything, Matthew. About how scared I was, about the medical bills, about having to leave school. I wrote about missing you so much it felt like dying. She took a shaky breath. I wrote to tell you that I understood if you couldn't wait for me anymore. Mrs. Chen was crying now, her oxygen mask fogging with each labored breath. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I thought you would hold him back. The room fell into silence except for the steady beep of monitors and Mrs. Chen's labored breathing. Matthew stared at Jane, understanding finally crashing over him like a wave. She hadn't just waited for him. She'd tried to let him go. She'd given him an out, and he'd never even known. Jane, he whispered. But she was already gone, disappeared into the maze of hospital corridors where she'd learned to become invisible. Matthew spent the next 3 days reading letters he was 8 years too late to receive. His mother had kept them in her cedar chest, just as she'd said, arranged chronologically and tied with a blue ribbon that he remembered Jane wearing in her hair during junior prom. Each envelope was carefully addressed in Jane's familiar handwriting, Matthew Chen, Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. The first letter was hopeful, full of updates about her pre-med classes and excited questions about his anatomy course. The second mentioned her mother's diagnosis, but focused on how proud she was of him for making Dean's List. By the fifth letter, desperation had crept in. Medical bills were mounting, and she was looking for a second job. The 10th letter broke his heart. I had to drop organic chemistry this semester. I know you'll understand. Mom needs me home for treatments. But I'm not giving up, Matthew. I'll catch up somehow. I promise I won't be the girlfriend who holds you back from your dreams. The 20th letter was shorter. I keep telling people about my boyfriend, the doctor. They don't understand why someone so smart would wait for a girl who's cleaning office buildings at night to pay for her mother's chemo. Sometimes I don't understand it either. But I made you a promise, and I keep my promises. The final letter, dated 3 years after the first, was barely 2 paragraphs. Mom died yesterday. Peaceful, at home, like she wanted. I know you're probably in your surgery rotation now, too busy to write. I understand. I've always understood. If you found someone better suited for the life you're building, I won't blame you. You owe me nothing, Matthew. But I thought you should know. I kept my promise. I waited. And I'd do it again, because loving you was the best thing I ever did, even if it wasn't enough. Take care of yourself, Dr. Chen. Make the world better, the way you always planned. Love always, Jane. By the time Matthew finished reading, his mother was strong enough for visitors, and he was strong enough for the conversation they needed to have. Why? Was all he asked when he entered her hospital room. Mrs. Chen had aged a decade in the past few days, guilt etching new lines around her eyes. Because I was afraid. Of what? Of losing you. Her voice was small, ashamed. Your father and I, we sacrificed everything for your education. Worked double shifts, took out loans we couldn't afford. When those letters started coming, talking about sick mothers and medical bills and dropped classes, she trailed off. You thought she would drag me down. I thought she would make you choose between helping her and finishing school, and I was terrified you'd choose her. Matthew sat heavily in the visitor's chair. I would have. I know. Mrs. Chen's admission was barely a whisper. That's why I hid the letters, because I knew you'd have given up everything for her. And instead, she gave up everything for me. Matthew's laugh was bitter. She kept waiting while I was posting pictures with Sarah on social media. She was cleaning toilets in the building where I was being honored for academic achievement. Matthew. She's been working here for 6 months, Mom. 6 months she's been invisible in the same hallways where I walk around like I own the place. Do you know what that must have felt like for her? Mrs. Chen closed her eyes. I need to make this right. How? How do you make 8 years of intercepted letters right? How do you give someone back the life they sacrificed because they thought the person they loved was ignoring their pain? But even as he asked the questions, Matthew knew the answer wasn't his mother's to give. The person who needed to make this right was himself, and he was about to discover that Jane Morrison, despite everything, wasn't finished surprising him. Matthew found Jane in the most unexpected place, not cleaning floors or emptying trash cans, but in the cardiac ICU at 3 a.m. sitting beside Mr. Rodriguez, one of the hospital's long-term patients. She was reading to him in Spanish, her voice soft and melodic in the dim lighting. "His family can't visit during the week," Jane explained quietly when she noticed Matthew in the doorway. "Work schedules, so I read to him sometimes during my breaks." Matthew stepped into the room, watching as Jane gently adjusted Mr. Rodriguez's blanket before closing the Spanish novel she'd been reading. In that simple gesture, he saw everything he'd missed about who Jane had become, still caring for others even when her own life had fallen apart, still finding ways to heal the world even from her invisible position. "How many languages do you speak now?" he asked. "6. You pick them up when you work nights." Jane gathered her things, clearly intending to leave now that he was there. "I should go." "Jane, we need to talk." "No, we don't." Her voice was quiet but firm. "Your mother told you about the letters. Now you know why I'm here. That's enough." "It's not enough. Nothing about this is enough." Matthew moved to block her path, not aggressively, but deliberately. "You wrote 37 letters. And you answered 0. The message was pretty clear, Matthew." "I never got them." The words exploded out of him. "I never got a single one. If you had what? You'd have thrown away medical school to come home and be poor with me." Jane's laugh held no humor. "Your mother was right, Matthew. I would have dragged you down. You wouldn't have dragged me anywhere. You would have lifted me up the way you always did." Jane shook her head. "Look at me, Matthew. Really look. This is who I became while waiting for you. Do I look like someone who lifts people up?" And that's when Matthew understood the cruelest part of what his mother had done. By hiding Jane's letters, she hadn't just kept them apart. She'd convinced Jane that her sacrifice had been invisible, meaningless, ignored. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" Matthew's voice was intense, desperate. "I see someone who dropped out of college to care for her dying mother. I see someone who worked 3 jobs to pay medical bills and never complained. I see someone who kept a promise even when she thought the person she'd made it to had forgotten her completely." Jane's composure finally cracked. "I see someone who mops floors in the hospital where her ex-boyfriend is a department head and engaged to someone perfect. Sarah isn't perfect. She's perfect for you. Doctor, beautiful, from the right kind of family. Everything I was supposed to become and couldn't." Matthew stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Jane, can I tell you something?" She nodded reluctantly. "Every single day for 8 years, I've thought about you. Every achievement, every milestone, every moment that was supposed to make me happy. I wanted to share it with you. And when I couldn't find you, I told myself you'd moved on, found someone better, forgotten about the promise we made." "I never forgot." "Neither did I." Matthew reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made Jane's breath catch, a small velvet box, worn around the edges. "I've been carrying this for 3 years. Jane stared at the box like it might bite her. "Matthew, don't." "I bought it during my residency. Kept telling myself I'd find you when I finished, when I had something real to offer you. But I never looked hard enough, and by the time I realized how much time had passed. You'd found Sarah. I settled for Sarah." The words hung between them like a confession. "She was everything I thought I should want, but she never made me feel the way you did. She never made me want to be better." Jane was crying now, tears she'd held back for 8 years finally spilling over. "You can't do this, Matthew. You can't come here and say these things when you're engaged to someone else. I know. And I'm going to fix that." "What?" Matthew took her hands. The same hands that had worked themselves rough in service jobs. The same hands that had written him 37 letters he never got to read until it was too late. I'm going to break my engagement. I'm going to tell Sarah the truth, that I've been trying to love her with a heart that belonged to someone else. And then I'm going to spend as long as it takes convincing you to give me another chance. Jane pulled away. I'm not 17 anymore, Matthew. I can't just pick up where we left off and pretend the last 8 years didn't happen. I'm not asking you to pretend anything. I'm asking you to let me earn your forgiveness. Let me prove that some promises are worth keeping, even when they're 8 years late. Jane looked at him, really looked, and saw not the boy who had left her behind, but the man who had spent 8 years unconsciously looking for her in every room he entered. Your mother was right about one thing, Jane said finally. What's that? I would have held you back, not from your career, but from the easy path. Loving me was always going to be complicated. Matthew smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. Jane Morrison, I've been taking the easy path for 8 years, and I've never been more miserable. I think it's time for complicated. What about Sarah? Sarah deserves someone who loves her completely, and I deserve a chance to love the right person the right way. Jane was quiet for a long moment. If we do this, if we try this, it can't be because you feel guilty about the letters. It has to be because you want the life we could build together, not the life we lost 8 years ago. Then let me take you to dinner, not as the boy who made you a promise, but as the man who wants to make you new ones. Jane smiled through her tears. I have to work until 6 a.m. Then let me take you to breakfast. Best coffee in the city, and I happen to know a doctor who can get you the morning off. For the first time in 8 years, Jane Morrison began to believe that some promises were worth the wait. The diner was nothing special. Cracked vinyl booths and coffee that was stronger than it was good. But Jane had never felt more nervous sitting across from someone she'd once known better than herself. You look different, Matthew said, studying her face in the early morning light streaming through the windows. Older, tired, wearing a janitor's uniform, Jane replied with dry humor. Stronger, wiser, more beautiful than I remembered, if that's possible. Jane felt heat rise in her cheeks. Matthew, don't what? Tell you the truth? He leaned forward, his eyes intense. Jane, I spent 8 years with the wrong woman, and do you know how I knew she was wrong? Jane shook her head. Because she never challenged me. She never made me want to be better than I was. She fit perfectly into my life without changing anything about it. Matthew's voice grew quiet. You changed everything about me just by existing. That was a long time ago. Was it? Matthew pulled out his phone and scrolled through something. Look at this. He showed her his medical license. Not the paper copy, but a photo of the framed version in his office. Jane squinted, confused about what she was supposed to see. Look at the middle name, Matthew said softly. Jane's eyes widened. The license read, Matthew James Chen, M.D. But she remembered his full name from high school, Matthew David Chen. James wasn't his middle name. I legally changed it 3 years ago, Matthew said quietly. James was your father's name. You told me once that you wished you could have given him more time, could have been the daughter who made him proud before he died. Jane's coffee cup trembled in her hands. You changed your name? I told everyone it was for professional reasons, easier to pronounce in medical settings. But the truth is, I wanted to carry part of your family with me. Stupid, maybe, but that's not stupid. Jane's voice was barely a whisper. That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me. They sat in silence, the weight of 8 years of separation and misunderstanding settling between them like a bridge they'd finally figured out how to cross. Matthew, Jane said finally, there's something I need to tell you about why I'm really working at the hospital. I know why you're working there. Medical bills, no degree, limited options. No. Jane took a deep breath. I'm working there because I found out 6 months ago that you were the head of cardiology. I took the job specifically to work at your hospital. Matthew stared at her. What? I wasn't randomly placed there by fate. I chose to be there. I chose to see you every day, even if you didn't see me. Jane's cheeks burned with embarrassment. I told myself I just wanted to see if you were happy, if you'd become the man you dreamed of being. But really, I think I was punishing myself. Punishing yourself for what? For not being enough to make you fight for me, for not being the kind of person worth 37 letters. Matthew reached across the table and took her hands. Jane, you were worth fighting for. You still are. And if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you. Jane looked down at their intertwined fingers, his soft from years of wearing surgical gloves, hers rough from industrial cleaning supplies, and saw not the difference in their stations, but the perfect fit they'd always been. What do we do now? She asked. Now I talk to Sarah. I explain that I've been living a lie, and I set her free to find someone who can love her the way she deserves. And then? Matthew smiled. Then I convinced the most brilliant woman I know to let me help her finish her medical degree. Jane blinked. What? Jane, you were accepted to Johns Hopkins 8 years ago. You had a full scholarship. You think 8 years of life experience makes you less qualified? Not more? Matthew, I'm 25. I'd be starting over from scratch. You'd be starting over with someone who believes in you completely, someone who owes you 8 years of support and encouragement. Matthew's grip on her hands tightened. Let me help you become Dr. Jane Morrison. Let me give you back the dream you sacrificed. Jane stared at him, hardly daring to believe what he was offering. Not just love, not just forgiveness, but the chance to reclaim the life she'd given up. That would take years. We'd be students again, broke again. We'd be together. Finally, properly together. Matthew brought her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. Jane, I've been rich and miserable. I'd like to try poor and happy for a change. And for the first time in 8 years, Jane Morrison began to believe that some promises were worth more than the sacrifice they required. Dr. Jane Morrison adjusted her white coat one more time before pushing through the doors of the cardiac surgery suite at St. Catherine's Medical Center. It still felt surreal, seeing her name embroidered beside the title she'd dreamed of since she was 17. Ready, Dr. Morrison? Asked Dr. Matthew Chen, her husband of 2 years and surgical partner of 1, as he reviewed the patient files beside her. Always, Doctor. Chen, she replied, the same response she'd given him every morning for the past year as they prepared for surgery together. Their patient today was a 45-year-old construction worker with a family history of heart disease, the kind of case that reminded Jane why she'd wanted to become a doctor in the first place. The kind of patient who deserved doctors who understood what it meant to fight for your family's survival. As they scrubbed in side by side, Matthew caught her eye in the mirror. Nervous? No, Jane said, and meant it. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The surgery took 4 hours. When they emerged, victorious, to deliver good news to the patient's anxious family, Jane felt the same rush of purpose she'd always imagined medicine would bring. But what made it perfect was sharing it with the person who'd never stopped believing she belonged here. Later, in the doctor's lounge, Matthew pulled out his phone to show her something. Sarah sent this, he said, displaying a photo of a beautiful woman in a wedding dress, beaming beside a tall man in military dress blues. She looks happy, Jane said, genuinely pleased. She found someone who loves her completely, Matthew agreed. Turns out setting her free was the kindest thing I could have done. Jane smiled. And Mrs. Chen? Still apologizing daily and plotting to give us grandbabies. Matthew laughed. She's convinced that making us the chief of cardiac surgery team is adequate penance for 8 years of intercepted mail. Jane leaned against him, still amazed sometimes that this was her life. That the girl who'd once counted coins for her mother's medication was now Dr. Morrison. That the promise she'd made at 17 had somehow led her exactly where she was meant to be. "Matthew," she said softly. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your mother hadn't hidden those letters? If we'd stayed together through college?" Matthew considered this. "Honestly, I think we would have struggled. I think we would have been too young to handle everything that happened to us. Maybe we needed to become the people we are now to love each other the way we deserve." Jane thought about this, about the girl who'd mopped floors and the boy who'd forgotten to look for her, about all the ways their separate journeys had prepared them for this moment. "So you're saying your mother accidentally gave us a gift?" "I'm saying maybe the best promises are the ones that survive everything designed to break them." Outside the windows of St. Catherine's Medical Center, the sun was setting over the city where two 17-year-olds had once made a promise they were too young to understand. Inside, Dr. Jane Morrison and Dr. Matthew Chen were living proof that some kinds of love are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, and worth 8 years of believing in the impossible. Some promises, it turned out, were just getting started.